We have to still believe today with God all things are possible. Nothing really hard or bad ever happened to me as a child, and so the unintended consequence of that was I grew up with a theology that if you do things the way God wants you to, then everything's going to turn out just fine. And so it was very shocking to me as a young adult when my 51-year-old father became sick with cancer, and I just kept thinking to myself, well, it's God's just going to tell a good story, because the Bible tells me if I pray in his name, or if I pray where 2 or 3 are gathered, or if I pray with a healing oil, like he's going to turn this around. And all throughout my dad's illness, I just kept rallying the troops. And as he was getting sicker and sicker, I'm like, God's just putting water on the altar. He's still going to light it up. And I didn't really have any room in my mind and heart for something other than exactly what I wanted to happen. And so it was very shocking to me when the Lord took my dad home with him. And after that, we broke up for a little while, Jesus and I, because I didn't know if I wanted to follow someone who disappointed me that way. And then, life apart from Jesus does not feel good. So I came back to him, but I didn't really resolve that issue. I just created a spiritual workaround. I called it sometimes my spiritual bruise. Like I knew there was a tender spot in my heart, but it hurt to touch it. So I just worked around it. And I went on to be a missionary, and I was living even a professional Christian life. But I still had this wound inside of me that we weren't dealing with. I'm sure the Lord wanted to, but I was not willing to go there. During my first year as a missionary, we got pregnant with our first baby, and I was so excited to have her, and my husband and I were looking forward to her birth. But at the same time, I had an adoption seed that had been planted in my heart years before I ever realized if my body would work. And so that year, we stood in a court to adopt our son, who was the same age as our biological daughter. And I had been only a mom for a few months, so I wasn't really that much of an expert at it. But as soon as I held this baby boy, I knew something was wrong with him. I didn't know what. I had no medical training. I didn't know what was wrong with him, but his legs were scissored and I couldn't open him up. His arms were in this crazy kind of position, and they were really tight, and I couldn't straighten out his arms. And he was born in the rainforest, so he had this growth in his mouth that made it difficult for him to eat, so his belly was all bloated, and he had this fungus growing on him. So, we were looking at our cross-legged, frozen-armed, fungus-covered, bloated belly little baby. And I had him evaluated at a children's hospital in my hometown. And I sat in the office of a neurologist who was looking over at my double stroller at my 2 children and looking at me, who I'm sure he thought I looked immature and underprepared for this assignment. And he said, "Hey, you look like a whippersnapper, so I'm just going to say it to you straight. There are 4 degrees of cerebral palsy: mild, moderate, severe, and profound. And your son has severe cerebral palsy. He's not going to walk or talk or live independently. And the faster you get your head wrapped around that diagnosis, the better off for this baby it's going to be." And this man had no idea what my spiritual bruise was, but there is no doubt on that day he was grinding his heel in it, because I thought to myself, I can't even ask God to heal him because he doesn't do it. I've already asked that. I begged God to do that all throughout my dad's illness, and he didn't do it. So I don't even know what to say. I don't even know how to pray. My son went to occupational therapy on Monday and physical therapy on Tuesday, and this hot water therapy on Wednesday, and this magnetic therapy on Thursday, and then I was at therapy on Friday, and we were just all busy trying to stay healthy. And not much was happening with his body. He was not meeting any of his developmental milestones. We were crazy about him, but his body wasn't cooperating in the ways that we had hoped it would. And then when he was 18 months old, a woman came to our house, a physical therapist came to the house, and when we were sitting there, Evan started to cry because his sister had come over and stolen his toy, and he couldn't go back and get it, and that was a very familiar scene. And so I rearranged his body. His muscles were hypertonic, so very painful to move, and I got his toy back. And the lady was watching all that, and she said to me, "Hey, you know what, Beth? It looks to me like you're rescuing him too much." And I said, "Hey, you know what? Why don't you get out of my house?" I was offended, and I was scared, and I escorted her out of my house. Today, she's a beautiful supporter of our ministries, but that day we were not friends. And Evan was crying by the time I came back in the playroom, and I joined him. And I was crying about him. I was crying about my dad. I was crying about my missionary dreams. I was crying about all kinds of things. And I left the room to go get a Kleenex. And when I came back in the room, he had moved. And more than he had ever moved it till that point. Enough that I forgot about what I was crying about, and I got in front of him. And I just started talking to him like, buddy, look at you. You're like, it's not really pretty, but you're moving, and like, you got this, and let's see what you could do. And he moved enough in those few minutes that I left the room to go get my phone so that I could call someone to come see what was happening at the house. And when I got back in the room, he had gone all the way across the floor and was stuck up against our couch, which had like a fabric skirt to it. And he fisted his hands on that fabric. And it wasn't really that pretty, but I just stared at him while he started to rock his body. And then he popped himself up to a stand. And when he stood up, all the hair on the back of my neck stood up, because I knew somewhere inside of me that I was looking at something supernatural, but I just didn't have any I didn't have any framework for that. And then he held on to the side of the couch and he cruised across it. And he got to the end and pivoted on his ankle and walked into my arms. And in that moment, I just grabbed him. Like, I grabbed him and his sister, and I threw them in car seats, buckled them in, and I drove 100 miles an hour to where their dad was. And he saw me come in and take out one of the bushes, so he came outside to see what was on fire. And I didn't have any words. I just stuck him on the ground. His son and Evan walked over to his dad, and were like crying and talking about like wedding aisles and soccer fields. And it was this like, I mean, are you kidding me? What just happened? It was a miracle, and we knew it. And by the time he was a preschooler, he had never again had another sign of cerebral palsy. And we were living in Mexico where they play a lot of soccer. So I stuck him on a soccer team, and he would run down the field and score a goal. And I was still so tender about that miracle. I would be crying on the sideline, and he would be like, you can't come with me to my games if you're going to keep crying every time I score, Mom, And eventually he would go on to play college football. And it still was very special to me what God did for us. I think now when I feel a sense of disappointment because the circumstances that I'm hoping for, wanting for, praying for aren't unfolding the way I want them to, I can still be tempted. I'm not beyond still stomping my feet and shaking my fist at Jesus. Like, it's still that I still want what I want because I want it. But what's changed is inside of me. Now I realize he's telling a story that's bigger than I can even imagine. And listen, the reason I tell you something like this is not so that you know something wildly personal about our family. The reason I share this, testify to you, is because we have to still believe today with God all things are possible. I am the same girl who had the same measure of faith and talked to the same God about two people that I loved. And one of those stories did not turn out at all how I wanted it to. And one of those stories actually turned out way better than I even imagined. And at the end of the day, the way God healed my spiritual bruises, he taught me he's sovereign. And if he's going to write a story, I can trust him it's going to be good. And I think to myself, like, good Lord, could I see things from a perspective that's not natural? When I stomp my feet and shake my fist, it's because I'm looking at things only from this perspective. But is there some way that God could seat me in the heavenlies and give to me the kind of peace that comes with trusting that the story's not over yet?